Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending upon where you are joining us from today. Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to host our first conversation of the day. Today, we are going to be talking about coffee, which I know is something that's an intimate part of everyone's lives. I must confess, right at the very beginning of this panel, I am not a daily coffee drinker, and I know that puts me really outside the realm of most humans on this planet. But today we're going to be talking about coffee and the intimate links to sustainability and how climate change is affecting coffee, which, of course, is a primary crop for many agriculturists around the world, grown in many regions around the world. I'm thrilled today to be joined by three expert speakers. We have with us David Browning, who's the CEO of Enveritas, and we have Anmol Vanamali, who's the Director of Sustainable Finance at Windrock International. And we also have with us Moises Gonzalez, who's the head of the Latin American Caribbean Regional Program based in Nicaragua at Christian Aid. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. It is
Great to
nice
be
to
here.
see you all. David, I want to come to you first for a little bit of a scene setter when it comes to this topic. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about Enveritas's model, what you do, and how you are intimately focused on linking coffee farmers in particular to sustainable practices.
Great, thanks, and thanks, Teresa, for hosting this session. Enveritas provides sustainability assurance for supply chains for large multinationals, but has looked to re-engineer this process compared to the situation we were in about 5 years ago, where a relatively modest number of farmers were able to participate in the process. And that's not because they didn't necessarily have sustainable practices, but because the actual processes of being able to measure whether a farmer was undertaking sustainable practices or not was quite expensive. And so the opportunity that existed was to utilize changes that have occurred in technology over the last 5 years to be able to bring that cost down, actually make it completely free for farmers, but be able to do a rigorous sustainability assessment that would let farmers participate in the market. And this was important for a couple of reasons. One is the sustainability was important for farmers themselves to protect their farms and their environment for their family and for the future generations. But it was also important for them to be able to access markets, because what we didn't want in a world where there were really two groups of coffee farmers that had access to the sustainability markets were increasingly growing, and then farmers who were shut out from that.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, right? Where, we oftentimes in the West don't necessarily think of, where the coffee is coming from, right? And you do unfortunately have those two tiers often of, people that are able to follow those practices that have access to that sort of market, and then smallholders that perhaps don't. And so, how you sort of navigate that and focus on bringing everyone in to the sustainable market and giving everyone access to a place where they can actually get a livable wage for their crop, et cetera, and ensure that everyone is able to participate in that. Anmol, I'd like to come next to you to hear a little bit about how Winrock is working, on the coffee issue. You're, an expert in thinking about, sort of sector-specific sustainability, and so, coffee, of course, being one sector of the food system. How does Winrock think about, sort of coffee individually, as well as its model of sort of thinking about sector-specific sustainability growth?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Windrock International, by way of introduction, is a global nonprofit, and our mission is to empower the disadvantaged, increase economic growth opportunities, and sustain natural resources. And you can't really achieve any of that without turning your attention to the agricultural sector, which has really been the mainstay of Windrock for the past 40 years. As far as our approach to agriculture, as in general, is concerned, um, a lot of our work goes in improving access to markets, in increasing entrepreneurship opportunities, and improving value chains. Within the climate change realm, we work on both the mitigation and adaptation side, because the agricultural land use sector provides opportunities for both and challenges for both. So we have one of the leading teams that works on understanding the intersection of the land use and agriculture sector with carbon emissions and what the carbon sequestration and reduction potential there is. But simultaneously, because of the linkages of agriculture and climate adaptation and economic resilience, a lot of our work increasingly is going towards ensuring that agriculture value chains, especially those that involve smallholder farmers, are being positioned to be resilient in a changing climate. And coffee happens to be a favorite topic for many windrockers because it's the fuel that drives our daily routine. And a lot of our work happens in that sector. I personally lead a project in Indonesia, which looks at climate resilience in the Arabica coffee bean specialty in northern Sumatra. And we clearly see ways in which the learnings from that can be applicable to other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think that really is sort of the compelling piece of the coffee issue, right? Is because it is something that touches on us all most days. And I had the opportunity actually to connect with your CEO from Winrock, Rodney Ferguson, last month in New York at the UN General Assembly, and we were talking a little bit about this coffee piece and some of the programming. And I write about food systems, and so we've at Devex really been working to explore all aspects of that. And obviously, the connection to COP is the sustainability piece, the impact on climate. And Rodney was telling me about some of the work you guys have done in Myanmar in terms of really connecting farmers to the market and helping farmers sort of figure out, okay, this is the way I've always grown my, crops, and this is the practices that I use, but how can we really capitalize on the knowledge they already have, increase yields while being sustainable, and give them access to markets? Moises, I'd love to come to you next to hear a little bit about the coffee issue from your part of the world. You're coming to us from Nicaragua. Central America is a huge coffee growing region in the world. So I would love to hear a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that coffee farmers in your region are currently facing.
Thank you. Yeah, in the case of Christianity in Central America, particularly in Nicaragua, Christianity is working with small-scale producers and their cooperatives, and in order to provide the access or allow the access to climate information, in order to contribute to the capacity to make resilience building decisions. In that case, we have worked with some cooperative and partners here in Nicaragua, and we have developed with them an agrometeorological information system to provide climate monitoring, but also crop monitoring. It means that the small farmers are involved in collecting information, climatic information, but also receiving the analysis of this information and also about the phenotype monitoring of the crops that they are using in these in their farms. And in the other part, we have supported also the climate modeling. Our partner Centro Humboldt in Nicaragua have developed a system based on PRESIS, the regional climate modeling software, and applied to various crops, and not only coffee, but also beans and rice, to analyze what is the longer term viability of these crops in the region, and how the small farmers can adapt and can make the decision and can make the right investment, looking at the longer term situation for these crops.
And Moises, what would you say, are some of the challenges for farmers having access to that knowledge? A lot of my travel, usually when we're not in pandemic times, is to Central America. So I've seen, coffee farms in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, as well as in Colombia. And, you have people that are really passionate about what they do, and a lot of different types of programs that are, trying to help get people access to things that can help grow their crops in a changing environment, whether that's increased or decreased rain patterns, process and growth of pests, which obviously is a huge issue as well. So what are some of the specific things that farmers you are finding are facing, and, do they typically know what to do, and how is Christian Aid sort of working to help get them what they need to be successful?
Okay. Yes. No, I think that the main problems that the small farmers are facing related to the coffee production is about how to manage the system in trying to move from the monoculture system to a more diversified system in the farm, because they cannot depend only on the coffee production. How to introduce other crops that are able to provide sustainability to the farm and the families. And for us, it's really important that the small farmers have the opportunity to access the right information to make decisions. It means to, I think it is really important how the investment are oriented to provide the right technology, but also the technical advisory to the small farmer, and try to analyze how the changes in the climate are affecting the crops, and what is the correct decision that they need to take in order to ensure the sustainability of the families, the crops, but also the coffee production in that case, because in many cases is the main economic activity. But also for us it's really important, and for the small farmer, and because their knowledge, they know that it is really important to have a very diversified system to deal with the climate situation, the climate variation, and how the change in the temperature, for example, is affecting the coffee and the coffee production and the productivity. And in case of small producers working in areas below the 1,000 meters, maybe they need to diversify with cocoa. It's the opportunity that we have worked with these small farmers, introducing new crops able to be adapted to the new condition in the climate in the area. And in that case, the introduction of cocoa production has been an opportunity, but it has been based in climatic information and climate analysis between different organizations, and the inclusion and the dialogue with the small scale farmers in the area, in the region.
I think that point that you make, Moises, is so important about, how everything is connected, and how we really have to think about this biodiverse ecosystem. And it's, of course, not just a coffee crop. We can make coffee thrive more if we actually also introduce additional crops, and they can all sort of work together to make the whole system more sustainable. And you mentioned two things that I want to pick up on. David, I want to come to you on the technology piece and talk a little bit about, the importance of getting smallholder coffee farmers the appropriate technology that, is allowing them to adapt to these sustainable practices, as well as have that market access.
Yeah, there's been some really exciting changes in technology on a number of different fronts over the past 10 or 15 years, some of which I've been involved in. There were opportunities about 10 or 15 years ago, there were opportunities to in new processing technologies which were dramatically less capital intensive. And so historically there were many smallholder farmers who were missing out on the entire value of their crop because they just weren't able to process the coffee in a way which maximized the value. But new technologies emerged which enabled mills that could be constructed with far less cost, far less footprint. You could literally unbolt a mill and put it in a shed at the end of the season. And this allowed 30 to 40% increases in premiums for farmers who were in high altitude areas. So that was a really interesting technology that came along. We helped create a system over the years where vetiver grass could be used which is a new way of ensuring that wastewater management was done more effectively. So rather than having a lot of the processing pulp end up in rivers and then having derogatory effects for livestock and for people, there were new technologies which enabled very cost efficiently but far more environmentally friendly to enable the pulp to get captured by the bed of a grass. The bed of grass then converted that pollution into biomass, and the rivers were cleaner. More recently, with the emergence of machine learning and artificial intelligence, there were tremendous opportunities we saw, which led to the creation of Enveritas. That processes could be done far more cost efficiently than they'd been done historically in the past. Farmers, in many cases, smallholder farmers actually are conducting their coffee sustainably. There just hasn't been an effective way to measure that, because there are 12.5 million coffee farms in the world. It's very fragmented. They're using, they might have a very small income, maybe $150, $200, but a sustainability audit might cost $3,000. So there wasn't just really a way for them to be able to validate to the world that they're sustainable. Some of these technologies, such as machine learning, have enabled us to dramatically collapse the cost so that these farmers could participate. And then finally, I think in the realm closer to home with the conversation around climate in Kyoto, there's or the COP26, there's a lot of attention now on carbon and net zero, and how do we validate that deforestation isn't occurring in supply chains, which is one of the potentially large contributors to carbon in supply chains. And with machine learning, we've been able to dramatically improve the effectiveness and lower the cost of being able to do deforestation detection. So we effectively now can use satellite imagery to monitor that in a way that wasn't possible even 4 years ago in an accurate way.
And why is that monitoring so important? You know, what do you hope to achieve by being able to give farmers that information and say, you know, my carbon footprint of my entire operation here is X, and, you know, therefore I'm contributing in this way, or I know I need to change my practices in that way? Why do farmers specifically need that type of information?
Yeah, well, I guess for two reasons. One is their customers are increasingly making commitments to the global community on this front. So the large coffee companies of the world are making commitments around what is the carbon in their supply chain and what their plans are to do that. So if you want to participate and sell coffee to a company who is making those sort of commitments, then you need to be somehow involved in a way where this can be measured and an improvement can be made over time. So that would be sort of one important reason why this becomes important to farmers. But secondly, there are some really exciting possibilities emerging around to what degree carbon can get trapped in soil and soil organic carbon. Still fairly early days in being able to measure this at scale and be able to see how what sort of changes in farm practices can occur. But there certainly are opportunities for win-win, where farmers are able to utilize more sustainable practices. That leads to a better ability for the soil to be in a healthier state, more able to withstand where there's heavier than average rainfall, pest and disease, but is able to trap more carbon in the soil, and then you get this virtuous cycle where their soils are better. Companies are looking for that sort of coffee for the promises they're making to regulators and customers. So that sort of virtuous cycle win-win is sort of some of the exciting opportunities that are coming out of this carbon debate.
And I think it's going to be really interesting to see sort of where that trend goes now, because I do think a huge piece of this sustainability conversation is driven by the consumer that you brought up, right? People have sort of an ever increasing desire to know where the things that they're consuming that they use in their everyday lives are coming from, and what sort of environmental impact the production and transport and all of that across the whole value chain, the whole food system actually has, and basing their purchasing decisions off of that, and saying I want to support a coffee company that is sourcing their beans from farmers who are using sustainable practices and all of that. So I think we're gonna keep seeing that growing, and we're a leaders meeting at COP, and various conversations here in the US about what's really going to drive the climate change actions that we need to be taking to actually achieve the goals? Is it something that governments should and can be mandating, or is it something that needs to be market driven? And that's certainly a conversation that we're having politically here in the US at the moment. But really is going to make a difference how much consumers, I think, are demanding this. And obviously with a product like coffee that is, again, a part of so many people's lives. Anmol, I want to come back to you on the second piece that Moises had raised on financing, and talk a little bit about how Winrock is thinking about sustainable financing, not only with coffee but across other agricultural value chains, and how you're working to help direct particular investments to developing a more sustainable value chain.
Sure, absolutely. And as much as I'm a finance guy and this question is about finance, the fact of the matter is finance is only a means to an end, right? So a lot of the work in finance actually begins with the people who will be absorbing the finance, which, if you take a value chain approach, could be up and down the value chain, starting with the farmers all the way to the buyers or the end user of the product. So we do take a value chain approach to understanding where finance is most needed and most effective. um, a trap that we really try to avoid is to generate pools of capital for the sake of generating pools of capital. So in in our estimation, it is most effective when you target the part of the value chain that is most adept at absorbing and deploying finance. So to give you an example, in the work that we are doing in Indonesia, it is clear to us that capital is needed at the farm level. But based on some of the work that actually Enveritas has shared with us, your team that works in that region, we also know that the farmers over there are indebted, and the last thing they need is to take on more loans. They are farmers, they don't get excited about loans. Bankers get excited about loans. So how do we then create a mechanism in which an intermediary in the value chain is the one that gets the financing and is able to create alternative repayment methods for the farmers to be able to borrow, and then as part of their normal input output cycle, absorb that additional capital. So that's generally our approach to finance. And so that's on sort of how we create the financing mechanism. But we also know that in order to put that together, we need to work with different financial financial sector actors. So on one hand, we work with local banks as the actual holder of capital that is then lent to the intermediary. But then we also work with donors that provide um, technical assistance capital or grant funding to strengthen the capacity of the value chain. And we also work with the philanthropic sector, impact investors, to create the right sort of de-risking mechanism so that the local banks are actually able to engage in a way that they hitherto aren't able to. So it's I think I learned a term yesterday in a net zero discussion called radical collaboration, and that's certainly the approach that we use.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you're hearing from donors. I mean, where are donors at on this sustainability piece? As we were talking about a little bit earlier, the market has definitely been shifting more and more in this direction. And, are you consistently getting interest from donors in directing investments, directing funding and financing towards making the value chain more sustainable? Do you feel like that's at the top of people's lists at the moment?
Increasingly so. I would say, as an international development organization, that is our bread and butter, right? We work with donors in areas of programming that are of interest to them, and consistently for many donors, agriculture and food security has been a core issue. The change we've seen over the past 4 years is the demand for including private sector actors up and down your different areas of programming, whether it's as non-capital intensive as capacity building to the more capital intensive interventions like creating access to finance. And I think that's because of two reasons. First of all, donors and governments know they can't do it alone, right? Second of all, the private sector is where the real capital actually lies. So if we really want to make long-term transformation, we have to create pathways in which the private sector can be involved. So I think while the amount of attention that donors pay to this sector hasn't changed, what has changed is their mandate that we are supposed to comply with, which is to ensure that we bring the private sector along across all these activities and interventions.
Yeah, definitely. I think as you said, the role of the private sector is, always going to be front and center of this, and they can drive the conversation, but it is about creating those incentives, right? Of let's bring you along and make this the best way to be operating and ensure that the financing is going to the right places. We've got just about 5 minutes left. I want to come back to each of you one time with the same question, and we have leaders meeting at COP. What is the message that you would deliver to them, from your part of the world, from your piece of, this development landscape when it comes to sustainability? What's something that you really want them to have in mind as they're having their conversations? Moises, we'll come to you first.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, no, I think that it's really important that we remember that the 70% of the world's coffee is on small scale producers and their cooperative. Is this sector? This sector has a very important role in the coffee production. The second, I think that in terms of the sustainability, it is important that to build resilience for coffee means adopting also agroecological methods, trying to change the mentality about the system that we are promoting through the coffee. In that case, we need to talk about systems which are really diversified and are able to incorporate different elements in the production system in the farm. And the other point I think is important, you mentioned before, is about the low prices that the small farmer receive for the high quality product they grow, and how to change this way of distribute the richness. And also important because if the small farmer receive enough and fair price, they could invest in a better system in the farm. They can be more resilient, and then we are going to have coffee. If not, the coffee disappears.
Exactly. I think that's a pretty important call to action. We can't have the coffee disappear. The rest of the world will stop functioning. David, let's come to you on this question.
Yeah, I think my message would be for those in COP26 to just be persistent. This is a difficult process. It's easy to get impatient with the process. Democracy is messy, but international diplomacy and trying to bring together multiple nations even more messy. There are many different voices. There are many different constituents. It isn't as easy as simply asking all governments to charge forth with an agenda that isn't necessarily that they don't have their own citizens aligned with. And we can see that just in the US with the sort of the 2 steps forward, 1 step back that has occurred from Kyoto to Paris to now. So point 1, I think, would be just to recognize that this is it needs persistence, it needs stamina, it needs resilience, but just sort of to keep at it and not to get distracted by the noise, not to get distracted by by so many things that could get in the way of a very monumental, really multi-decade effort that has to take place. And secondly, to certainly look at how the public sector and the private sector can help advance agendas in their own ways. They're very different. They have very different strengths and weaknesses. But one of the great opportunities in the private sector is the private sector can move much faster. It doesn't have the same sort of decision-making processes that require an enormous amount of consensus building. Rather, companies are able to, with a much smaller set of decision makers, decide that this is the strategy, this is what we believe in, this is what we're going to go forward in. And by doing that, I think particularly multinational companies can really set a great example, because they can play a catalytic role where they can demonstrate this is possible, and doing that in a very rigorous way, which sort of setting a vision, that's simply not enough. Then actually having to build the plan that will actually map that vision, and then that's not enough. And then actually executing that plan. But in doing that, and in their own microcosm, I think that what the world is looking for and needing is these inspirational examples of success. And so in their way, they can then set an example that gives that sort of sustenance to the broader international efforts that we'll need if we're going to make progress on this issue.
Yeah, definitely. Keeping the eye on the prize here. I think, like you said, there's so much noise. All right, to close it out, Anmol, we'll come back to you on this question.
Right. I think my plea to the participants of COP26, especially the decision makers, is to focus on adaptation. We have unfortunately altered the Earth's geophysical conditions, and as much as I hope we can stop it from going beyond a certain threshold, we still have to deal with the impact. So my plea would be to focus on adaptation and actually help make the leapfrog that we need. Right now, climate adaptation finance is only 5% of global climate finance, and we need to grow from 30 billion a year to 300 billion a year in less than 10 years. But I think we can do it, and we can learn from some of the successes we did on the mitigation side. We need the right combination of technology solutions, capacity building, incentives, and finance. And when we package that together in collaboration with the private sector, the donor sector, and governments, I think that leapfrog is possible. But on one hand, my plea is to not reinvent the wheel. On the other hand, it is to be creative on how you leverage what we've already done before.
Excellent. I think that's a great sort of hopeful call to action that we can end on, that, you think this is possible if everyone does what we all know that we all need to be doing. Like you said, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. I think the way forward is obvious. It's just a matter of doing it. Thank you so much to the three of you for joining us. We really appreciate having you with us today. I'm going to put in a quick plug at the end here for Devex's Food Systems newsletter, where we are exploring the intersection of all of these issues, sustainability, biodiversity, coffee, and what that means for all of us here. And you can find our newsletter, Devex Dish, if you just Google that. And I think we'll also have a link in the chat for you. We would love to have you join our community and subscribe to the newsletter. Thank you again for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.